Hey folks, Chad Perkins here for Maxon, and in this tutorial we're going to take a look at the 5 Dither plugins in Universe, and also we're going to be looking at palettes as well. Now, if you're in the Universe dashboard, in the Generators category, you'll see Custom Dither. We're going to cover that one. And then in the Stylize category, you'll see 4 more: Error Diffusion Dither, Ordered Dither, Halftone Dither, and Threshold Dither. And then also in the Utilities category at the very end, you'll also see palettes. And we're going to cover all 6 of those in this little tutorial. But first, let's talk about what Dither is. Dither's a little confusing, so I have a little visual aid to help me here. I'm going to close the dashboard, and I have several different gradients here. And when you try to approximate, one color going to another, and it's also not just for graphics or video, but it's also in audio as well. It's any kind of a digital thing. You're trying to recreate these smooth flowing things that exist in the real world. That can be really hard to do digitally. And so when you're going from one value to another, sometimes that's not always a smooth, easy ride. And so we introduce like noise between those two to kind of soften the gap. Let's look at how this works here. I'm going to go to this adjustment layer. I find that with Dither, if you want to bring things together with the Dither plugins, it's a great idea to use adjustment layers rather than applying it directly to your footage. But if you only have like one clip or something like that, then it's fine to use it to, obviously, But using it on an adjustment layer will allow you to do everything in your composition or your sequence, apply Dither to all of it at once, which can be very unifying. So I'm going to go to the Effects and Presets panel. If I just type in Dither here, you could see all of these. Ignore this little preset that shows up here, but these uni dithers are the things that we want to focus on. So I'm just going to go ahead and apply Custom Dither here, and you can see what it's doing with these gradients here. We have a simple black to white, we have a rainbow, and then we have the 4-color gradient. And by applying this dither, we're seeing, if I zoom in here, that we're kind of, going from white to black, but we're just using white and black here, but it's kind of created these noise patterns that kind of fool our eyes into thinking that there's a more gradual transition than there actually is. It's just solid white and black, but because of this noise pattern, it fools our eyes into thinking that it's kind of a more gradual pattern. Now we can reduce this if we wanted to. We can adjust this so I can increase the dither intensity, and so now we're getting more of that gradation. I could also increase the posterization level because it's posterizing the black and the white. So if I said, give me like 2 levels of posterization, well, then we have a lot more. I can go back to dither intensity, dial this back down again. Now, these controls are pretty common through several of the Dither plugins that we'll be looking at. If I go to the Dither size, this is perhaps the most important. This has like a really big impact on the way things look, but it's kind of like resolution. You could think of it as. So as I take this to 1/4, we get smaller, then we have like less resolution. We have bigger dither pieces, and that changes the look, as you can see here. So we take this down to 1/16 as the lowest resolution, and we have we've gone from Lego to Duplo blocks, basically. We have a thin resolution with a lot of detail to now like these thick chunks with less detail. In this Custom Dither plugin specifically, which we'll be talking about a little bit more later, we also have the ability to adjust the Bayer settings. We could increase the matrix size if we wanted to do that. We could also adjust the stippling, which is very cool. So if I wanted to increase the more tiny details, I could increase the stippling, which creates cool effects. Now you might be wondering at this point, especially because all that we're looking at is just these boring gradients, why would you ever want to use that? Well, it can create some pretty cool looks, as we'll see. I have the stock footage, very smooth gradations here. And let's say I'll apply Ordered Dither to this. And Ordered Dither kind of creates these patterns that are really cool. But we've already kind of stylized our footage with just the default settings here. We get this really cool vintage effect. We could again bring in more detail by increasing the posterization level. We could also adjust the dither intensity, where we're seeing more dither. We have more colors dithered. We could also adjust the dither bias. So that tends to kind of make things brighter or darker. all to kind of like dial in the look we're going for. But I'm just gonna go ahead and reset this. But what's really cool is just this pattern, this detail that we're getting, this noise. It's just so nostalgic, but it's also kind of gorgeous in its own way. You know, it's basically little pluses and crosses and little dots. But when you zoom out, it creates this pattern that's pretty elegant, or it can be elegant if you use it that way. So here in the Order Dither plugin, we have a lot of the same controls that we were just looking at with the Custom Dither plugin. But here we have the order type. So I can change this from Bayer to void and cluster, and that creates a different look, to random, which is just more noisy. I'm going to delete this. There's also Error Diffusion Dither, which is a different kind of algorithm, or allows you to use different sets of algorithm. Now, in the early days of computer graphics, when dithering was taking off, you know, they were starting to realize that we need more than just like an ordered pattern to create dither. So a lot of like computer scientist type folks were going in and trying to create these different algorithms that would create smoother patterns of noise. And that's called Error Diffusion Dither. And that's what this is trying to replicate. And you have all these different error diffusion types, you know, Floyd Steinberg and Jarvis, Judas and Ninke, and all these different things. Atkinson is an interesting one. This is actually named after Bill Atkinson, who was a programmer at Apple. And he actually invented the little marching ants that you're familiar with if you use a photo editing program. And with this Error Diffusion Dither, from farther away, you know, we have more smooth gradients because of the way that the dither algorithm is set up. But I do kind of miss the uniformity of the ordered dither, like kind of like the crosses and the pluses and stuff like that. I kind of like the way that looks. So it's just kind of like a, you know, choose your own adventure type thing. I'm going to delete this. The one other one I want to look at in this example is threshold dither. And actually I'm going to turn this off momentarily, and I'm going to apply just the standard threshold effect. This is like a, you know, an After Effects oldie but goodie. We have the threshold, and we basically just can adjust the threshold. It's a very great utilitarian effect. Sometimes we could use it for stylizing looks or whatever, but it basically turns every pixel white or black, and you can control where that midpoint is. Well, threshold dither is similar, but also has dither included. So we can increase the posterization level if we want to, but also we can adjust the dither size, and we could still go back to luminance if we want to, but we have all of these dithering options here as well, including like, you know, the dither bias and posterization level, and we can invert this and all kinds of stuff. Now let's go look at how to use this in a more cool way. I have this robot here, stylized robot from Trapcode Geo, and it looks gorgeous, made by our own Ian Robinson. You know, it's sculpted in ZBrush. It's this gorgeous little fun robot. But I can stylize this very quickly and easily using the Dither plugins. I'm actually going to first start by applying Sketchify from Universe. And that's going to remove some of this detail and make this more cartoony, a little bit more iconic. And it's also going to give it this kind of like black outline, which I love. And I do like that look by itself. But when we combine Sketchify with a Dither plugin, that's when we get really cool results. So now I'm going to apply Custom Dither here. And now look at this. I mean, this is just like so cool. So here's, again, this is the original, which is great. But then after, just applying these two effects, it just turns it from like a regular robot to just a legend, you know? It makes it absolutely legendary. And the fact that I wrote that in text also helps make it feel legendary. But again, before, and it's just kind of regular, and then after creates this like really iconic stylized look because of this dither. I love the way this looks. I could go back up here to the dither size, and I could lower this and make this even more broken down if I wanted to. And then right here, you know, as I look at this, it's a little bit too blocky. Those like blocks are a little bit too big. But you also kind of have to keep in mind your audience and their viewing angle, because the purpose of dithering was to make gradients look smoother. So even at this like 1/16, if I zoom out really far, it's going to look really smooth. So you have to, keep in mind your audience. If they're going to be watching something on like an iPad or watching this footage on an iPad, then it's going to be pretty big in their face. And we might want to adjust the settings differently than if it was going to be like maybe like an iPhone and it was going to be like a little bit further away. So just something to keep in mind. Here's another fun example. This is a scene that I made in Trapcode Particular. And by the way, all of these things that you're seeing, every single one of these things is a sprite available in Trapcode Particular that you could use. Every, like the brick, the treasure chest, the swords, the shield, all the bricks, bookcase, potion, skulls that are popping in and out. All that stuff is stuff that's available to you for free in Particular to use as sprites. So I just used the form behavior in Particular so that they wouldn't die or go away. And I built this scene using several systems in one instance of Particular, which is pretty fun. And it's already kind of stylized, because it's like a video game. These like are pixel art, but I could add some dither to this to really even enhance the effect even further. So I have an adjustment layer. I'm going to go ahead and apply my fave, the Custom Dither. And already, I mean, this is, it killed a lot of my color, but this is already pretty cool here. And I could go ahead and maybe increase the dither intensity a little bit, and maybe the dither bias to maybe like bring that up. And then actually now I'll take down the dither intensity. I could posterize this more if I want to. And then what's also kind of cool about this is that in the color palette drop down, we could posterize the colors, which is what we're doing now, and the default. But I could also use bicolor, which uses these two colors. So if I wanted to kind of split the color here and have it just be like two colors, or if I want to do like tricolor and recolor it with tricolors, I can do that as well. But this is what's really cool. There is a palette browser, and this is actually very similar to the palettes effect, which is basically a standalone version of this palette browser that you can use to colorize your footage. And what I did is I clicked on this little icon right here to import these palettes that I found on the internet. And it's amazing all the palette types that you could bring in here. If you just have a ping file with the colors in it, it will make a palette out of that. If you have a text file, if you have a Photoshop ASE swatch file, if you have a text file, if you have a hex file, there's just a huge range of files that you can bring in as these different palettes. So I'll just use this like Ready Punk, for example, click apply. And now this is using the colors in that color swatch, which is really cool. And after putting a little bit more effort into it, then you could see this final version that I had here. And this just looks like something just straight out of the 80s. And something that I would really enjoy playing. And by the way, I'm scrubbing this in real time. You can see that it's not loaded into RAM. With the recent changes to Particular, I mean, this renders so fast. I mean, I'm scrubbing basically in real time. And not only do I have all of these systems in Particular that are live, but I also have the Dither plugin going on, and it's being colored as well. So we have a lot going on. And it looks really cool. And also, what's really funny is that these skulls fade in and out. I used in the form behavior in Particular, I used the opacity fractal noise to affect the opacity of the skulls so they kind of fade in and out. But when you have dithering, you can't fade in and out. A pixel is either on or off when you are using dither. And so then it creates this kind of like really cool, I'm just going to zoom in on this little guy right here. It creates this cool kind of like eating away effect when they fade in and they fade out. They kind of like dissolve like, a character in an Atari game or something like that that's been killed and kind of just dissolving away. I just love that effect. It's so fun. And again, it's rendering so very quickly with all these things going on. It's impressive. Now, by the way, another effect that I have to give a shout out to, I'm going to take off the visibility of the palettes effect, which I applied in my final example here. And I'll go back to Custom Dither, go back to the palette browser, and I'll say palette browser. And in this case, I'm going to choose the Game Boy Pocket color swatch that's already built into the palette browser, one of the presets that ships with it. There's all these great game systems, NES and Commodore and Atari and stuff like that. I'm going to click apply. And so then instantly I have this like very believable Game Boy Pocket looking game because of just presets from particular, presets in palettes, presets in Dither, and we have this kind of cool look. Now, another one of my favorite of these Dither plugins I have not talked about yet is Halftone Dither. Let's talk about that. Here I have a couple pieces of art. I have my favorite painter of all time, Alphonse Mucha. I have like this beautiful piece from him. It's like so iconic and legendary. And then I also have this, footage from, an old library in the 1800s or whatever, just like this kind of like old print ad of like these birds, and they don't really seem like they go together. So what I want to use is this Halftone Dither in order to unify them and make it look like it's a print ad. So what I can do is move this out of the way. And again, so like the design is kind of like nice. But again, what I can do is use these plugins to unify the worlds. I can take these disparate elements that don't feel like they belong. And when I apply the same stylization to both of them, then they kind of do feel like they belong in the same world. So I'm going to go ahead and again, I'm going to make sure that I've got an adjustment layer selected. I'm going to apply Halftone Dither to this. And already we see like a really interesting effect. We see that they sit well together. This particular setting doesn't really work great with this particular project. I'll talk about this in a second, but we have 3 different halftone types, which makes this effect very interesting and very useful. And we have the monitor setting, so it makes it look like we're actually looking through a monitor. If you zoom in really close, it's like you're getting really close to the TV, where you're seeing the red, green, and blue lights, all kind of like the photons or whatever they are on the TV. You sit too close. And then also we have LED, which is pretty cool. And I'll talk more about LED in a second. But what I really want to do is get to the printer settings, because this then simulates the way that printer halftone patterns work, which is very cool. Already at the default settings, this is really kind of pretty. I love the way that this looks. And just so we could see more, I'm going to play with the dither size a little bit. If I take this up to like 12, kind of keep increasing it, we're going to get like less resolution. Those printer pieces, the dither size is going to be too big. So I might bump that up just a little bit to 12. That looks pretty good. I could also, in harmony with that, I could adjust the spacing of the dots. So this dither size adjusts the size of the dots, spacing adjusts how close they are together. So this is looking pretty good right about there. Now you'll notice that as I adjust the dither settings, there's nothing happening in the white areas here. There's no dots being added. And that's one of the brilliant things about this, because when you're actually dealing with CMYK, which is what you're doing when you use a printer halftone type, then you're actually working with a different color model than RGB. You're working, instead of working with light as you are in RGB, where it's additive, and the more colors you add, the brighter it gets. Like think of spotlights pointing at something, it's going to get brighter and brighter and brighter. But with ink, it's the exact opposite. The colors are the opposite. The way that they work is the opposite. So then as we add more color, we're actually going to be darkening things. So white actually in CMYK is the absence of any colors whatsoever. So there's no need to reproduce white with halftones, because with halftone pattern, because there's nothing to reproduce. That's just like emptiness. It's basically like the equivalent of an alpha channel if you're dealing with video. So what I can do, if I want some dots there, if I'm missing that kind of texture, what I can do is I can hit Command-Shift-Y or Control-Shift-Y on the PC on my solid, and then I can click on my solid here and maybe make it a little bit like a light gray. Yeah, it's a little hardcore. Overdid a little bit, but make it a light gray. And now it has to use halftone dots in order to recreate that background. So now we have like that texture there as well. Now, another thing I could do is go back to my adjustment layer, and I could adjust the pre-saturation, which kind of changes the way that the halftone dots can align sometimes, and also the post-saturation. So now we make this a little bit more vibrant, make this pop, which I love. And then the final thing I want to do is an extra little trick. When I started playing around with these Dither plugins, I started realizing that very quickly that I really wanted to have a black outline around the objects. But if I did that, like in the original Mucha art here, then we see that it gets turned into a halftone pattern as well. And then we get this kind of like, bumpity bumps along the edges of our objects. And I don't always want the bumpity bumps around the outline. I want to have like a solid outline the way that Mucha used to do as well. So what I can do, what I did was I created these outlines, and I'm going to solo these layers. And there we go. So what I did is I soloed these layers, and I made these masks. And I did this trick. If you right click on a layer, you can go to layer styles, and then you could add a stroke. Now there's a million different ways to add outlines in After Effects, but for this particular effect, this trick, I think this one works the best. There's a lot of ones you could use like keying and chokers and a bunch of stuff, but I think this, from my experiments, works the best. So I can go layer styles, add a stroke, and then what I can do is I can open up this layer, and then inside the layer styles, I can adjust the thickness of this with the stroke value. See that? Adjusting the thickness of the stroke. But then if you open up blending options and open up advanced blending, there's this fill opacity. And so by default, this is set to 100. So you're seeing the stroke and the object. But if you reduce fill opacity, then it's going to remove the object and just leave the stroke. So then what I can do is blend this back in with my original footage. And it's like we have a stroke around the object as well. So again, here is what it looks like without, and then adding the black stroke back in, it looks like so. So before and then after. And I love how this extra little element that we added kind of now almost looks like it fits with the Muka art, which is really cool. And another example here, this is another thing from Trapcode Particular. These are these little explosive fun sprites that explode, and I did the same layer styles trick where I made a second layer on top with just the black outline, composite those both together. So these things kind of explode. And then if I just go into my Halftone Dither here, I already turned this on. We create this kind of like cool comic book, Roy Lichtenstein effect, you know? And so we have this like pop art kind of comic book thing, which is like very cool. Now, I want to look a little bit more at the halftone effect and some other tricks that we can do. Now, I have made this entire composition using elements from Maxon Studio, just using bits and pieces from different things, and I assembled them all together, and I used the edit page to very quickly change the color of the Wi-Fi signal, the rocket, and like everything else. But the text here, the text is very complex, and that's not something that's available easily. Like you can't go in the capsule, in the edit page, in this particular capsule, and change the colors. So that's where the palettes effect can come in. So I can go into my glitch typography, and I actually did this already. I applied the palettes effect. And then what I can do with the palettes effect is go and browse palettes like we looked at earlier. And then I have my user imported palettes at the top. And then I also have the other palettes included with it as well. And then what I can do is go into hue offset if I want to and adjust, you know, which hues I'm seeing here, if I want to adjust that, or I can go to Dither bias and also adjust how those colors are landing on my text. And once I got in the right neck of the woods, I can go ahead and apply some optical glow. And then now we have this like a cool thing, but also, you know, it looks like they don't kind of like really belong together. So what I did is I also add an adjustment layer, and I use this to kind of play around with some different stylized looks. So there's ordered dither, and I fiddled with the settings to get this kind of like late 90s look, like a King's Quest V, Monkey Island, that era in computer graphics when we were like displaying photos, but kind of poorly. So that's kind of like what this is all about. Like maybe I'll turn off the blue background. There we go. Yeah, that's feeling pretty nostalgic. And there's also Halftone Dither. And I didn't mention this before, but when we set things to monitor or LED, we also have access to pixel scale Y and X independently. So we can make these kind of like wider pixels, these wider halftone patterns, or these taller halftone patterns, and create some really interesting looks that way as well. It's one of a great way, any time that there's an effect that allows you to create kind of like organized chaos like this, where, you know, once we've taken our image and like destroyed it a lot, now it looks like kind of like random waveforms, and it's just like a lot of complexity and chaos. I love tools like that because, you know, otherwise what do? You have to build this stuff from scratch. Like that's too much effort. I don't want to do that. Nobody wants to do that. So then we can use these effects to create these types of results very quickly and with very minimal effort, which is very cool. And then I also use CC Composite to composite this text back on top of this so we could see a little bit more clearly. And then also I use CC Lens to kind of like wrap this around and make it look like it's on like some kind of like 90s TV set or something like that. So that was pretty fun. So that's another result. And then I also did Halftone Dither again with the LED setting. Now the LED setting is actually really cool because it also has pixel scale. And so we can adjust this and make it non-uniform or whatever. But this LED scale is actually really, really cool. If I zoom in here, and I'll take this back to its default, just right click and just like reset this. Then you can see that we have these kind of like red, green, and blue dots. And just like an LED screen, the amount of red, green, and blue dots varies to create these end result colors, which is really cool. But if I increase the LED scale, these little LEDs keep getting bigger and bigger, and they're allowed to overlap. And then once they overlap, it's almost like we create this kind of like bokeh effect, like a combination of halftone patterns and bokeh, like these little like light effects, which is also really cool in its own right. And now that they're all sparkly and stuff like that, looks like, again, it's like a different kind of video game or something like that. It's a blast. So there you have it, folks. 5 different Dither plugins and the Palettes plugin to help you play with your footage, to go crazy, to make a little chaos, to have a little nostalgia, or however you want to stylize your footage. So enjoy playing. Thanks for joining me again. I'm Chad Perkins for Maxon. Have a good one, folks. Take care.